Now, to help me examine the issues surrounding illegal land occupation in the country, I'm joined by the Executive Director of Development Action Group, Aditya Kumar, a Research and Advocacy Officer at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, Edward Molopi, as well as Abahlali Basem Jondolo President Sbu Zigode. We'll be joined as well later on by Ward 36 Community Leader Mzolisi Mhlaudi. And to be a part of that conversation, you too can tag us on Twitter at Newzroom 405 or send us your WhatsApp questions and comments to 072-110-5584. Gentlemen, good evening and thank you very much for joining us tonight on the Newsfeed Late Night.
Thanks for having us on the show.
Good evening. Thank you for having us.
Aditya, I'll begin with you. Now, we know that in South Africa, besides the fact that government has, since 1994, been constructing state-subsidized housing, there remains a housing crisis in the country, characterized by the politics that are going on in the country, but also there are technical issues that go with this, social issues as well as racial issues and communities protesting. There's xenophobic violence that comes with it and all sorts of other issues. Just for a moment for us, just outline in your own words, what are the systematic challenges in the way of land claimants to obtain land and housing in South Africa?
Sure, that's a heavy loaded question. So maybe to just kick us off. So, I mean, I think government has claimed that there's about 4 million housing opportunities, whether it's the RDP style housing or service sites that have been built across the country. When in 1994, there were close to about like 300 informal settlements. Currently, there's probably anywhere between 2,500 to 3,000 informal settlements. So there's been an exponential growth in the number of people living in informal conditions, whether it's informal settlements, whether it's backyard structures, and that has really been the core of the problem. So why the big question here is, why is it that despite so much of housing delivery, we continue to see so many people being landless and homeless? And I think that's really the root of the problem. The couple of key issues that particularly come to my mind is, firstly, that the kind of housing program has been centered on kind of this developer-driven housing production on the periphery of the city. And that has really left large numbers of people living on the periphery of the city, having to commute long distances for economic opportunities, which has been a huge burden on the poor to commute to find work and to find employment and so on. The second piece really has been kind of this policy flux that we're experiencing in the country at the moment. It's extremely confusing at the moment what the current kind of policy framework is being driven. At one level, the president is talking about smart cities. At another level, the National Department of Human Settlements and Minister Sisulu are talking about rapid land release and providing service sites to people, whereas the policy frameworks are talking about an incremental approach towards informal settlement upgrading and the provision of housing for people. So there's a myriad of views which are causing a lot of confusion in the sector about what should be the solution and response to the housing crisis and the landlessness. We're finding close to about like 2.2 to 2.5 million households without adequate housing in the country, which is really a huge concern for all organizations that are on this panel and outside.
And is that a number that is stagnant, or is that a number that is growing? And how does that in itself add to the inadequacy of being able to allocate to those families?
Absolutely. And part of the problem has always been around this idea and notion about this housing waiting list and this allocation of housing. And the narrative has now shifted towards talking about the deserving poor, which is really no qualification. It's not about disaggregating the poor into smaller categories and saying these are the people that deserve the houses and these are the people that don't deserve the houses. I think people have been disenfranchised for too long to make these distinctions between who deserves the house and who doesn't deserve the house.
Yeah. Edward, come in here with us as well and help us understand what shapes the constraints around the house demand and allocation in South Africa. I mean, there's this thing that Aditya just talked about called a housing shortlist, which seems to suggest that there is some kind of a rational process that is underway that prioritizes those who are first in line, and therefore those who are first in line are getting those houses. Is that a myth, or is there really such a thing that exists?
Thank you for the opportunity. I mean, I think there are two things here. So firstly, there is a sort of like a housing subsidy system that's in place, right? The confusion then comes towards when people are looking for themselves to be as part of a list that's listed in terms of chronology and names and housing list and that kind of thing, such that, I mean, a person would think that they are number 85 or number 87 on the list, such that if a housing program comes into place and delivers housing for, say, 90 people, because there are 86 on the list, then they would get the housing. But unfortunately, that kind of list does not necessarily exist. So what's in place is that there is a housing subsidy system in place, which is meant to operationalize how the housing is delivered, and it monitors these allocations. But in terms of an actual list of people sitting on it in a chronological sort of way, that doesn't exist.
Yeah. So should we completely eradicate that from our public discourse, but also from the strategy that a government is trying to adopt here and follow as far as the allocation of housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to go with education and perception of what this demand database exists and what it entails of. So, I mean, if we do need to, I think, disillusion ourselves of that kind of system. So municipalities have, I think, spoken about it and sort of like hinted at its existence. I mean, I remember City of Joburg a few years back wanting to have that kind of system in place, but they haven't managed it. So yeah, I mean, I think there are many factors that go into the provision of the housing itself. And so I think people need to be aware that that kind of list doesn't exist, and that, well, I mean, in terms of the allocation of the housing itself, that continues to take place, although it has decreased significantly in the last couple of years.
Aditya Kumar, stay with us. Edward Mlopi, stay with us. We'll take a view of Sbusigode in a moment, as well as Mzolisi Mhlaudi as well. We'll take your thoughts as you participate in this conversation via the tag on Twitter at Newzroom405. Send us your WhatsApp questions and comments to 072-110-5584. The practices, the perceptions around housing demand and allocation in South Africa, and what influences the practices in the state, be it informally or even practical norms in terms of handling this situation of allocating houses. That's what we talk to next when the Newsfeed Late Night continues. Seconds. Hey, Babu Zagot, are you still there?
Hello.
All right. Just talk again.
Right.
You're this.
Right. It sounds the same on one.
It's sounding on you, and I hope the line will hold. We'll try. We'll give it a go.
Yeah.
Stay with you on the Newsfeed Late Night. Thanks for staying on. The debate rages on the demand and allocation of housing in South Africa. Aditya Kumar, Edward Molopi, Sbuze Gode, as well as Mzolisi Mhlaudi with us tonight to tackle that particular question. We're taking your thoughts in a moment and comments to what we are, of course, discussing tonight. Sbu, let me bring you in here. It is a big problem for provincial governments and municipalities, the housing crisis. But the question is this a man-made problem or other technicalities to it, a more complex, nuanced conversation we need to be having around why there is, of course, the kind of protests we are seeing, the kind of illegally occupying of unallocated subsidized houses?
Thank you very much for having Abahlali in this important conversation, and just to greet my fellow panelists here. Well, for us, it's really the choices that our political leadership and, of course, the policymakers do that we have these crises. So it is a man-made problem that we are facing. We know that the allocation of housing in South Africa is being politicized. If you are not closely connected to the political leadership or party structures, particularly the ruling party, you will actually be pushed out, and you will not. In fact, you get told in your eyes that you will not get a house. So the allocation of houses is really a problem because there isn't any clear and clean housing allocation policy that is transparent and democratic, and this is what we've been calling for. We've seen housing being allocated by local councillors, which by law aren't supposed to be closer to any of the allocation of housing. Yeah. So as long as we have corrupt councillors putting their nose on the allocation of houses, then the entire process would be problematic.
So then talk to us about what happens in practice in the state, right, within the state, but also you're talking of the politics that are happening outside. So give me a typical example of, for example, what would happen if there is a project of 800 or so houses being built, or 945 flats in this particular instance. What happens in the actual practice within government, but also the politics that happens around it?
Yeah, I think the problem is when there isn't any clear plan, when communities are not consulted, and when there isn't any housing list where officials, municipal officials, as well as the councillors will use their own discretion. That's what they will do to actually identify who would benefit and not. So that's where exactly the problem begins. So then you find that people that would be, I mean, you can put your name, but only to find when it comes the time to allocate these houses, your name is removed. So there is a lot that is happening within the system. And of course, communities are not involved in this process. I mean, you would have the steering committees, you would have community structures that would actually should be working with the housing officials. So who
is involved in this illegality? You're saying there's a councillor. I mean, how does it work? Does a municipality entrust a councillor with a number of houses and say, well, you decide who gets allocated? Or how does it actually happen?
Well, in fact, the officials of the municipalities would be involved, as well as the community leaders, the structures. We will have the steering committee within the community, and what committees, for instance, who would know communities much better, who would be working hand in hand with the officials, not the politicians, not the local councillors, because their involvement is actually the one that causes the crisis that we face today when it comes to the allocation of houses. But the community structures are not respected, they are not consulted, they are not engaged, and you find that the officials of the municipalities who do not even understand the local dynamics within the community would empower themselves and actually take up the role of deciding who should get the house and who's not. And the criteria that is set in terms of the law, that one needs to have an ID, of the Republic of South Africa, that one is to have dependents, that one is to be earning less than 3,500. All of that is just on papers. In actual fact, that's not considered. You will find in some cases that one family received more than one house, and because certainly politicians are involved. I mean, we have living examples in our communities where each house is allocated to 2-3 families, and they all have what they call happy letters to say, this is my house. So, and it shows that the allocation of houses happens at night. It happens on the bonnet of the vehicle of the councillors. And at that stage, we do not know exactly who should be answering to the community. I mean, this evidence, we have it in our office. I mean, Siri will attest that there are families who are fighting over one house because all of them were officially handed over by city officials.
Yeah. And what representations, Edward, does the state then make when such revelations come to the fore?
I mean, there isn't really anything.
Sorry, I just want to bring Edward. I'm going to come back to you now. Edward?
Sure. I mean, look, we have a case that we're actually just in the Constitutional Court just a few weeks ago. And this is particularly a case that relates to what Mr. Zikota is alluding to, where you find beneficiaries being allocated a housing subsidy and having a house being registered in their name. And then when they go to try and take occupation of the house, they actually find that there are people who are living in that house. In this particular case that I'm referring to, the city of Kuruleni in this instance did admit in court that this maladministration was on their part, and it had to do, I think they actually said that it had to do with corruption within the municipality. So it's a big factor in terms of these housing allocations, that the corruption itself within the administration does hamper on this already strained allocation process.
Yeah. Now, the last time this happened in September last year, the government's response was that we are concerned about these illegal occupation of these unallocated houses, and law enforcement authorities must act. I mean, an eviction order, is that the appropriate intervention here in an instance of this nature? Edward?
Well, I mean, if you look at it, so for example, if you go and you evict those people, right? And it turns out that that eviction is going to lead to homelessness, then that particular municipality, in terms of law, they do have to then provide alternative accommodation for those people that they would be evicting out of that property. So, I mean, they can consider an eviction, but in any case, what's that going to end up doing is that the municipality still needs to find alternative accommodation for those people if it becomes apparent that the eviction will lead to homelessness. So I think the issue here is to prevent it before it happens, such that there needs to be this allocation process needs to be fixed in such a way that these problems are fixed before they happen, because I think once they have taken place, then it becomes a big issue.
Adisha, is there a lack of imagination or maybe even ideas here as far as the allocation of housing, where a government takes the approach of one size fits all, when in essence, I mean, you've just raised a number of policy fluxes, as you put it, that seeks to address varying accommodation needs in South Africa. There are those who say, well, let government just give us land and we'll build for ourselves. And hence you hear the minister talking about the the rapid land release. And you have those who are saying, well, we want to stay closer to the city, and we want these housing establishments that allow us to be able to work and stay where we are working. And the president speaks of smart cities. But, I mean, these are varying accommodation needs, which I don't know whether the government is able to adequately respond to them.
That's precisely the point. I think the demand is so high at the moment that, in fact, any form of housing delivery is a huge boon. I think Edward already mentioned that, like, the housing delivery has significantly shrunk in the last decade or so. What used to be probably 10 to 15,000 houses being produced in any of the larger metros has now shrunk down to probably like 4,000 or 5,000 houses annually. And the other side of the particular case that you're dealing with is also the fact that, like, you know, anywhere between 30 to 35% of the people typically will also sell these RDP or BNG type of houses under the radar. And Sipu's absolutely right that very often the councillor aids and abets the kind of sales that take place behind the scene. So there's the problem, like kind of you've highlighted, is that the housing demand is so high and people are so frustrated for waiting for housing, sometimes waiting on the housing waiting list for up to 15 years, that they see no other recourse but to occupy those houses. And very often when politics get involved, like ward councillors interfering in the allocation of these houses and so on, then very often these houses get transacted. And actually the whole purpose of this program is to provide housing for the people who need the house. And unfortunately, very often it doesn't reach the right people. And that's really the core of the problem.
Yeah. Sipu, do you support the action taken, for example, in the Olievenhoutbosch situations where as residents allocated themselves places in the housing development, and are you concerned at all about that and the kind of impact that it has on the residents themselves, but also on those who are also probably believing that they are on the list and who believe that they qualify?
Well, the state needs to get their acts together because, first of all, there isn't any housing list, which then makes it difficult for a person who's waiting for more than 20 years to know at what stage one would actually get the house. But also the promises that councillors and politicians in general will keep making and sensitize these to communities. So when people have to occupy, we actually support that because we think it's fair. If justice wasn't done in the first place to the people, why it is seen as a crime when people have to act and resort to other alternative means in order to, to have what we call a home. Yeah. So we think the state here needs to be honest. Yeah. The politicians needs to stop making empty promises. They need to act responsible for everything that they say in community, because it is the reason why people get frustrated. And of course, one cannot wait endlessly because everything that they get told is lie. So we are running out of patience. So wherever there is an empty, vacant house or land, the honor is on us to actually occupy those empty buildings, those empty houses, occupy those lands. There's nothing else that you can tell a person that is homeless to wait. The person can no longer wait. So when we see vacant and used land, we think it is fair because the state hasn't been fair to us in the first place. So why people then are seen as criminal, or this is seen as a criminal act when people have to resort to finding a place home that is guaranteed by our constitution in the first place. So the government has a very clear, detailed plan as to how to eradicate and deal with the so-called invaders when they actually have no plan to provide housing before the frustration of people turns out to be in a state where people resort to self-helping. So the message needs to be clear today that the promises that they continue to make encourages people to actually act in fulfilling those promises.
The teacher Kumar with us, he is the Executive Director of Development Action Group, and we also have Research and Advocacy Officer at SERI, that is Edward Molopi, and with us as well, the President of Abahlali Basemjondolo, Sbu Zigode, of course, raising the issue of demand and allocation for housing, a crisis in South Africa at the moment. Adisha, I'm going to bring you in here. You're saying there is a problem of a developer-driven housing project. How else would we drive this housing project if, for example, we don't have developers who are ready to put projects on the ground?
Historically, a number of civil society organizations, as part of the RDP program, had also suggested what is called the People's Housing Program, now called the Enhanced People's Housing Program, which was really centered on the people's ability to build their own top structures in their own houses. And given with some support from the state, whether it's kind of the subsidy or whether it's through housing support centers, allowing people to build the type of houses that they really need. And this program has been gone on for about 15 years or so, but it's really shrunk in terms of the resources that are provided to this particular program at the moment. And unfortunately, what now happens and has happened in parallel to the People's Housing Program has been the process of appointing, large-scale tenders to big construction companies to build these type of houses. And in fact, part of the process of providing the housing subsidy is to provide and invest in the local economy. There are thousands of local builders, contractors, craftsmen who are available to build these types of houses, but unfortunately, very seldom do these contracts go to the people from the local communities, but instead goes to the larger construction companies.
All right, let's unpack a little bit more from the questions coming through tonight on WhatsApp, having to look at what the people are saying to this conversation. Here's a question coming from Lu Fulani, I think. The question is, do the tenants have a legal ground to stand on if they are being evicted out since they occupied the houses illegally? I'll give that to you to look at, Edward. In a moment. Livingstone also saying government systems are too slow. I mean, they know who applies. Why does it take years to allocate? Take, for example, the issue of the Z83. When applying for a job, regime change is vital. All right, I'll give that to you then Sbu to handle as well. Edward, talk to me about what leg do they have to stand on at this particular point if they have occupied the subsidized housing illegally?
Okay, so since occupation has taken place, that will be seen as their home. So, and in as far as the Constitution is concerned, that's Section 26 of the Constitution, and then also the PI Act, which is the Prevention of Illegal Eviction from and Unlawful Occupation of Land Act. What it basically says, that's the Constitution, Section 26.3, that no one may be evicted from their homes unless there is a court order that authorizes that eviction. So they have two rights. One right is procedural, and then the other is substantive. In terms of the procedural protections, they have a right to have a fair process in terms of the court process. So before they are evicted, that case needs to go to court, and they have a right to present all their side in terms of the occupation. And then in terms of the substantive protections, they have a right not to be rendered homeless. So if they have nowhere else to go, and they can demonstrate that, then they need to be offered alternative accommodation, and that is a local government prerogative, or actually it's a must that they should do that.
All right, I'm going to come back to you, Edward, with another question, particularly around the land issue and how that could possibly expedite matters. But Sbu, deal with this question of course, it takes long. The processes from application to actually when people see the delivery of the houses, it takes long. What is the suggestion from Abahlali Basemjondolo to expedite that process?
Well, the suggestion is very clear, is that first of all, there needs to be meaningful engagement with the people. People need to be informed of the government processes. That's very important, that communities are educated and they understand the so-called project cycle, the processes that needs to go, including your EIA, the environmental impact assessment, and so on. If people are not informed and you have the lazy and less informed councillors too, adding to that lack of knowledge, then creates a crisis. So if the government could be honest enough that to begin a project could possibly take 5 to 10 years, let them be honest about that. And then while people wait for that long process and that long system, then interim services be provided, for people to be able to wait that long. So what we are faced with is that the housing project cycles takes too long, people are not informed, and the state fails to provide interim services while people wait. And then you have these politicians adding lies and frustration and raising expectations unnecessarily. Yeah. So they need to be responsible to what they say to communities, but communities have a right to be educated around these processes and how government actually works.
But what I'm not hearing you say is consequence management for these officials and these politicians who are involved in this corruption. And part of the challenge here is that there are people who actually pay for those RDP houses. So they are also involved to an extent in perpetuating this corruption and making a space for it to thrive. I mean, you're not saying anything about what should happen there.
Well, sometimes it becomes very difficult when corruption starts from the top, where you actually have no one to report corruption, because the very same people you report corruption is corrupt him or herself. It is at that point where communities and the people of South Africa needs to take charge and take responsibility. Of course, there needs to be consequences for all these corrupt people and who are also seeing people as objects that you can just lie without really having consequences for that. So, and of course, when the trusted people that are in power are doing that, it's absolutely difficult for communities to hold them accountable, because we vote for them and suddenly they report somewhere else. They are no longer accountable to the very same people that they have actually voted them into power, which is why part of our responsibility is to empower and build the capacity of the impoverished from below, so that the power that we give to politicians, we can have capacity and power to recall them. That's the kind of system and mechanism that we have right now to build unity and solidarity within communities so that we are able to hold them accountable.
Now, Edward, the government is restructuring its approach to land restitution and land redistribution. They have announced that Cabinet has adopted, of course, the suggestion and the bill for a land court with greater powers to reform and redistribute the land, which, of course, is one of the issues, I suppose, at hand here, because when people are able to get land, I suppose they'll be able to put the top structures there for themselves. Do you think this approach would be one of the ways in which it could fast-track, Edward, the process of being able to get more people with more houses?
Look, I mean, I think in terms of the policies themselves, we do have, in a number of cases, sufficient policies to address some of these needs. It's also, a lot of it also depends on the implementation of these policies. So, I mean, I think, for example, if you look at informal settlements, for example, there is a policy that speaks to people who are already in informal settlement, which is the upgrading of informal settlements program. And a proper implementation of that particular program would significantly reduce the housing demand, particularly for people who are already residing in informal settlements, who make up also a large chunk of the people who are still looking to be housing beneficiaries. So, I mean, I think it's the efficiency of it, I think, will also come in terms of when it comes to implementation itself.
And what do you see as would be the bottlenecks in that situation, except for the fact that even up until this point, the land claims process has been caught up in court cases, and so there are lots of disputes around them, and so you have a backlog of these cases and claimants really never getting the benefit of that land. I mean, what else do you see as going to be the hurdle here?
I mean, I think one of the issues also would be in terms of the beneficiaries themselves, how allocation is given, and in a clear and a more transparent way. I think one of the issues that affects a lot of these programs is a lack of transparency. And so that lack of transparency erodes in a lot of cases confidence in the processes themselves. And when there is public, when the confidence of the public has eroded in terms of what the government is trying to do, that also impacts on the efficiency of this. I mean, if you look at the story, for example, of the housing allocation and people allocating themselves in the housing developments, it's because that there is now a lack of confidence in the process. And so people are now taking it up to themselves to self-allocate because they aren't seeing the process being fair and taking place in a transparent manner.
Adisha, I'll give you the final word here. One from Lucky on WhatsApp says there is a lack of communication within the housing system. A person receives an RDP house in Mpumalanga and again in Gauteng and again in Limpopo. Housing officers should do their part. There is some kind of disconnect, I suppose, in the system itself, the IT system not talking to each other, where you could be allocated a house in another province and the issue that you raised, then you're able to sell that house because obviously you're not inhabiting that house at that time. How do we fix that?
Yeah, I think communication definitely sits at the heart of this problem, and couldn't agree more with the panelists around kind of, meaningful participation with people who are involved in these processes. So I think that underlines it. I think on the question of the issue of land that you raised around this land court is a fundamental one when it comes to trying to resolve some of these issues. The big issue that we're facing in the kind of land space is that there isn't a clear pipeline or identification of either state-owned land and public land in a way to pipeline housing projects. And that creates a lot of confusion for people to understand what is it that the government, especially local government, trying to achieve. Are we trying to build housing for 200,000 people, 300,000 people? There doesn't seem to be a comprehensive, clear, simple plan that explains here are 50 parcels of state-owned land that are going to deliver these types of housing. Now, if you look at the kind of land reform and the recommendations that came out of the advisory panel and so on, there were three aspects to it. One was around the security of tenure, where people feel safe and secure on a piece of land, the issue of land restitution, and the issue of land distribution. I think this new bill is perhaps going to create a lot of confusion about any land disputes going to these land courts and overwhelm them with the number of cases they're going to have around land occupations, evictions, security of tenure, restitution, land redistribution. And when the expropriation without compensation becomes a reality, it's going to further complicate the work of these land courts in that particular matter. So I think communication is absolutely central in this. There has to be clarity of both vision, but also clear details in terms of how some of these processes are going to be rolled out. It cannot just be pie in the sky thinking.
Adisha Kumar, appreciate your time. Executive Director at Development Action Group, as well as Spuzi Gode, President of Abahlali Basemjondolo, Edward Molopi from Siri as well, and you for being a part of this conversation tonight.